And there are a lot of kids, especially the lower income minority neighborhoods, who literally just haven't seen it work.
In a clip from 2011 that is now being widely shared online, 2020 candidate Pete Buttigieg blames education disparities on a lack of role models in minority communities. So in this video, I'm going to show you that clip, but I'm also going to go into the actual reason there's an education disparity, and it has to do, of course, with funding. But first, let me show you this clip. Again, this is back in 2011.
You know, the kids need to see evidence that education is going to work for them, right? So you see a lot of parts of town.
That's part of the motivation.
Yeah, because you're motivated because you believe that at the end of your educational process there's a reward, there's a stable life, there's a job. And there are a lot of kids, especially the lower income minority neighborhoods, who literally just haven't seen it work. There isn't somebody they know personally
and I think that's
who testifies to the value of education. So yeah, you bet.
All right. This is totally ignorant, factually wrong. He has no idea what he's talking about. Now I'm going to get into discussing the details here in a second into why there is actually a education disparity. But first, let me just show you some other examples of why the black community does not support Pete Buttigieg. Black South Carolinians say Buttigieg campaign misleadingly touted their support. A number of black officials in South Carolina said their support for Mayor Pete Buttigieg's presidential campaign has been overstated or misstated completely. So that was a story I covered recently. I broke the entire thing down. Basically, Pete Buttigieg has this Douglas plan for Black America out, and he had these 400 prominent South Carolinians endorse his plan, his Douglas plan, when first of all, half of them are white. But on top of that, the three people that he touted as like the main important, prominent black South Carolinians that back this plan, they don't support the plan. They never endorsed it. I mean, one of them is actually a Bernie Sanders co-chair. So he sent emails out to these people, these 400 people, saying that if you don't reply to this and opt out before 4 p.m., then you've endorsed the plan. So, and look, I'm not joking. I know that sounds crazy. I'm not joking. That's what actually happened. So I broke it down in my recent video. I'm not going to go any deeper because it's in that video. But The Intercept covered it in the story. It's a crazy story. But here's another example of why black people don't like Pete Buttigieg. As president, Pete Buttigieg wants to give 25% of federal contracts to minorities. As mayor, though, he gave 3%. And this from TYT. Documents show police used Buttigieg donors to get him to fire black chief. So Buttigieg has a horrible record in the black community. These are just a few examples. And when you're talking about a candidate that needs to be able to defeat Donald Trump in an election, the black community is integral to the Democratic Party base. You need them to be excited to come out and vote for you. Pete Buttigieg doesn't have that. He's a horrible candidate. Now, let's get back to the video here. So let's analyze what Pete said in that video and why it's so completely insane and just totally ignorant. So he says, you're motivated because you know there's a stable job at the end of it. Talking about kids that go to school. Oh, you're motivated in school because you know there's a stable job at the end of it. I hated school. A lot of white kids hate school, but they succeed because there is a support system in place that is well funded that allows them to succeed. But that is not the case for many minority communities. So a lot of white people from wealthy neighborhoods will see this and think, oh, Pete's right. These black kids, these Latino kids, they just need some real role models in their lives, and then they will do well in school. And I mean, apart from being completely absurd, I know that a lot of white people think that because I'm from a white community. I grew up in a white suburb. People think like that. A lot of them are just not exposed to the reality of the actual reasoning behind education disparities. Now, you may think, okay, well, fine, David. I guess it's about wealth inequality, right? It's about, well, wealthier neighborhoods, black or white, are going to do better than poor neighborhoods. You know, black or white. Race has nothing to do with any of this. It's all about wealth inequality. Actually, that's not true either. It is about race. So there is a lot of data to back this up. This is not just an economic issue. This is a race issue. So this from U.S. News and World Report. White students get more K-12 funding than students of color. Report. Education funding formulas that have long been aimed at bridging economic inequalities have done little to address race-based disparities, a new report concludes. So this is a report that looks into a study from EdBuild, which is a nonprofit organization. So there is no, conspiracy behind why they're pushing this study out. No, this is just facts. This is the data on the ground. This is a nonprofit organization that looked into this. So, and by the way, this is one of many studies that looked into this and found the same results. But let me go a little deeper here. School districts where the majority of students enrolled are students of color receive $23 billion less in education funding than predominantly white school districts, despite serving the same number of students, a dramatic discrepancy that underscores the depth of K-12 funding inequalities in the U.S. So again, the fact is, all data shows that education in minority neighborhoods is underfunded, and that's what leads to this. Now, you may think, oh, but don't some of these states make up for that? Because I've heard that these states that have these disparities, because a lot of the school funding is based on property taxes. Well, states make up for that, so it all comes together in the end, all works out. Also, no. Today, at least 35 states actively work to redistribute education money to make up for the fact that wealthier school districts generate more local funding than poor school districts. But inequalities in funding don't only occur based on poverty. As the EdBuild report reveals, income is often a bad proxy for race. And despite attempts to distribute K-12 funding more equitably based on income, massive funding disparities still exist when examining the racial makeup of the districts receiving it. So, as I said earlier, school districts' budgets are tied to property taxes, so wealthier communities in general get more funding for schooling than poor communities do. But race actually plays a larger part in this. Researchers at EdBuild went a step further, comparing poor non-white school districts to poor white school districts. They found that on average, the poor non-white school districts received 11% less funding per student, or $1,500, a finding that Sebelius says hammers home the deep roots of racial inequality in education funding. A report from the Education Trust last year, which compared funding inequalities between income levels and between race, found that only 4 states showed significant discrepancies between their funding of poor school districts and wealthy school districts. But that number jumps to 14 when comparing funding levels for school districts that are predominantly white to school districts that are predominantly made up of students of color. So it's not simply about wealth inequality. It's about race. Now, the crazy part about all this is that Pete Buttigieg didn't even get one aspect of this right. I mean, he could have mentioned wealth inequality and how, poor districts are underfunded, but he didn't even mention that part. So for him, it's all about, well, there's no black role models. That's why these kids in these minority communities are not doing well. There's no black role models. I mean, how tone deaf is that? How just completely ignorant is that? And this is a presidential candidate. Like, he is just, it's amazing to me that the media that's getting behind Pete Buttigieg now actually thinks this moron has a chance. Now, there's, again, as I said earlier, there's more studies to back this up. Let me just give you a piece of that from NBC News here. So, schools with a majority of Black and Latino high school students have less access to high rigor courses than predominantly white schools. For instance, the authors, referring to a 2012 study called The Nation's Report Card, said 33% of high schools with high Black and Latino enrollment offer calculus, compared with 56% of high schools with low Black and Latino student populations. Nationwide, 48% of schools offer the rigorous math course. There is also a lack of courses in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, as well as advancement placement courses. This is a major factor in why Blacks and Hispanics are still heavily underrepresented in the STEM workforce relative to their shares in the U.S. workforce as a whole, according to Pew Research. So, looking at all of this information, you can understand why universally there is a negative impact on minority communities or communities of color compared to white communities that are funded at much higher rates than communities of color. So this is, I mean, again, you have a candidate here in Pete Buttigieg who has almost 0% in black support. Actually, there's a recent poll out showing in South Carolina he has 0% in black support. And when he's on television or when the media is talking about him, like in a recent MSNBC discussion on Morning Joe, they talk about, well, Pete Buttigieg has no support from the black community because he's gay. It's because he's gay. It's not because he has this horrible track record with the black community. No, it's because he's gay and they don't like gay people. It's disgusting. He has a terrible record. This is a terrible candidate. And I mean, if you support this guy, do your homework. Not only does he have this horrible track record, he also, on top of this, has no chance to win. He is terrible. You have to look. I know a lot of my usual viewers know a lot of this stuff. This is going to be obvious to you. But this is why you need to share these sorts of videos with friends and family who are not educated on this dude. And forget my video. Share the articles. Like, again, I want this information to get out there. However it gets out there, make sure the information gets out there. Educate people who are not educated on these candidates. Because if you have family or friends that are stuck watching cable news, MSNBC, CNN, where they have on people who are always praising, Pete Buttigieg or Joe Biden, I mean, those voters are living in a different world. They really have no idea who these candidates actually are, especially Pete Buttigieg, which, I mean, you saw in the last debate, they didn't even bring up the fact that Pete Buttigieg faked black support in South Carolina, even though that was a major story that week. They didn't even bring it up. If Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren did that, you can bet it would have been a huge topic of discussion. Buttigieg does it, not a peep about it. So you have to push these stories out there, inform others in your lives that are not aware of who Pete Buttigieg actually is.